Well, it's been another whirlwind week of headlines. Yesterday, our nation's highest court issued a perhaps surprising decision authored by Associate Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson regarding a case of so-called, and in reality, reverse discrimination. It came out of Ohio and was brought by a straight white woman who claimed she was demoted and passed over for promotion because she was heterosexual or is heterosexual. We'll discuss this case and more in our weekly Worldview discussion with David Closson. He's the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview at FRC. He's also the author of a new book, Life After Roe, Equipping Christians in the Fight for Life Today. David, thank you for joining me.
Hey, great to be with you again, Joseph. Happy Friday.
Well, happy Friday to you. This is a really interesting case to me that I want to kind of get beyond the legal arguments because those are real and interesting. But I think there's something beneath that we need to kind of pull out. This woman, Marlene Ames, a heterosexual woman, claims in her case before the Supreme Court that while she was working for the Ohio Department of Youth Services, she was passed over for promotion. Now, here's the interesting part. The Ohio Department of Youth Services did not say, no, we didn't discriminate against you. They said that because you are a white heterosexual woman, you have a higher burden of proof in proving that you were discriminated against. You have not reached that burden of proof. Therefore, we are not liable for anything. Now, the Supreme Court came back and said, actually, everybody has the same burden of proof in a discrimination case. Why did this argument even have to be made?
Yeah, Joseph, such a good question. And I think, the specifics of this are really interesting. And it's important to note this was unanimous. Ketanji Brown Jackson is obviously the most recent addition to the court, appointed by Joe Biden, and she wrote the majority opinion. Over years, this legal concept is known as background circumstances test, which is kind of a higher level of burden that folks from majority groups, so think white, straight, male, need to prove in these discrimination cases. And I think, again, I'm no legal scholar, but, these kind of concepts and ideas don't develop in a vacuum. And clearly, over the last couple decades, where you have the rise of, I think, critical theory, things like intersectionality, you're going to have concepts and ideologies and legal frameworks begin to develop that flow from the logic of even those ideologies. Now, as Christians, I think we should be excited what the Supreme Court decided, because as Christian, this ruling basically affirms kind of what I would call just the principle of equal justice. As Christians, we believe all people are made in God's image. We're equally valuable. James 2 is another text, Joseph, that talks about how God hates partiality. And so I think this is a good legal decision, and it's one that Christians, for theological reasons, can also affirm.
Yeah. And it's important to highlight the ways in which good intentions actually result in unjust outcomes. The Supreme Court has spoken to similar issues recently, where they've said you cannot prefer people of certain races over people of other races in your admissions practices to institutions of higher learning, and that has been done racially. And this is another example of where they've made a similar determination, where it doesn't matter if you're white or black, or you identify as heterosexual, or you identify as homosexual. Equal treatment under the law requires that the legal standard be the same for people who find themselves in similar legal situations. Now, why on earth would anybody disagree with that? Because, and you mentioned it, but I think it's worth kind of describing the critical theory mood that our country has been in, which says, well, if you are one of the oppressors, you should be disfavored. If you are one of the oppressed, you should be favored. And the way people seek to remedy what they perceive to be as injustice is to give preferential treatment to people in one group and disfavored treatment to people in another group. And I think that's where this is coming from. Oh, well, you're heterosexual, you're in power, you're the hegemony. Therefore, if you want to prove discrimination, you have to work harder to do so. And as a result of this, I think it's good intentions results in unjust treatment, where we, as a result, end up throwing out this standard of equal treatment under the law, which is supposed to be a bedrock American principle.
Yeah, Joseph, I agree with you. And I think kind of this ideology of critical theory, I think probably the most pernicious way that this has kind of reared its head in our modern kind of political discourse in the last year and a half is actually what's happening over in Israel, where you will actually have Americans who will say, well, looking at the situation between Hamas, which is a terrorist group, versus Israel, kind of the only stable democracy in the Middle East, well, there'll be those who sympathize with the Hamas terrorists because they will use the language, well, settlers don't have rights. And this is this privileging of minority groups just because the sake that they're part of a minority class. Again, this is pernicious. This is evil. Christians are the folks who should be on the front lines saying this doesn't cohere with a biblical conception of actual justice.
Right. And let's remember the worldview foundations of this idea of equal treatment under the law, because that hasn't always been how it's been, right? That was actually a Christian idea that was injected into a world that believed the rich and the powerful are better because they are rich and powerful, and innately they have more rights and more opportunities. And it was the biblical Christian idea that we are all created in the image of God, which injected into that environment this idea that it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, or in biblical terms, male or female, Jew or Greek, slave or free. Everyone, because we're created in the image of God, has equal value before God. Therefore, it is incumbent upon governments to recognize equal value before God. And that works when our identity is rooted in the imago Dei that is inside of each of us. What critical theory seeks to do is root our identity in who we're attracted to, what our race is, how much money we've made, and therefore treat people differently in those circumstances. And as we see in this case, that results in people doing what should be kind of absurd by saying, oh, well, you're straight, you have a higher legal burden of proof than your friend who identifies as gay has.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we use the phrase all the time, ideas have consequences, and underlying worldviews, underlying ideologies have significant consequences. So, this case is kind of an illustration in the legal arena, the legal realm of, again, kind of the manifestation of what bad ideas can do. And I think, because again, as Christians, we should be excited about this. And I do think, and we'll maybe talk about this later, Joseph, we're in a cultural kind of almost resetting right now, where there does seem to be a return to kind of some of these creation order principles. And I think that's something we should be welcoming, especially as Christians.
And that is something I want to get into next in our next topic here, because we, of course, know we are living in the holy month of Pride, according to the priests of the sexual revolution, right? And we, of course, were, is it the family month? Is it fidelity month? Anything but celebrating one of the deadly sins, right? And so any alternative is going to be better than actual pride. But something that a lot of people have pointed out is the fact that the enthusiasm for Pride this year seems to be down. Do you agree with that? And if so, what do you attribute that to?
Yeah, Joseph, I actually agree with it. And I'm here in Washington, D.C., which I'm told, this week or next week, there's going to be this World Pride event. But I would even say here in our nation's capital, it is more muted than it has been in years past. And I think there's several reasons for this. Just think about the backlash to groups and corporations. Think Bud Light. Their whole debacle with Dylan Mulvaney back in 2023. They lost $359 million because they partnered with this transgender activist to try to promote light beer. That debacle actually, for 2 decades, Bud Light had been the #1 selling beer in America. And I take that on faith. I'm a Baptist, have no idea personally, but I'm just told that, it was knocked off as being the #1 selling beer in America, simply because they kind of got in bed with the sexual revolution and thought this was a good idea with marketing. Think of Target. They lost 35%. Their stock did a value over one summer because of their Pride collection, Joseph. And so I do think the probably one of the main causes is that the sexual revolution has overplayed its hand. Think of things like, coerced pronoun usage, biological men being allowed to participate in female sports. Think of the medical interventions being pushed on minor children who are confused by their gender. And so I think kind of the T in LGBT has really overplayed the hand. You see this even last 2 weeks ago, Gallup came out with a poll and showed Republican support for same-sex marriage is down 14 points from just 3 years ago. And so I think all of that is kind of part of, again, like I say, this return to kind of creation order morality, because we've done this for a couple of years, and a lot of people are seeing this really doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's a couple parts of that I want to discuss with you, David, because one is like, what's the American people doing? And you cite kind of the polling from Gallup saying that support for same-sex marriage is down 14 points in the last 3 years among Republicans. But we also have seen corporate America kind of move away. Indications of that. I know that Seattle Pride, right? Or, Seattle, can you get any more progressive than that? Their budget for Seattle Pride had declined 30%, I believe was the number, because of a decline in corporate sponsorship even there. Do you think that we're seeing a situation where corporate America, and a lot of them have not rebranded their logos this holy month of Pride when they had in the past, and that's kind of a small but significant indicator that perhaps they were never really in it for the cause, but they were in it for the money. And now that Target and Bud Light have told them, hey, the money may not be all you thought it was or hoped it was going to be, maybe you should stay away. And so it turns out perhaps corporate America was just chasing the dollar anyway.
Oh, absolutely, Joseph. I think corporate America thought this was kind of the direction that the broader culture was moving in, first on same-sex marriage, then on issues related to transgenderism. I think there was a lot of bullying that took place. Think about, the Human Rights Campaign and their aggressive marketing plan that each year they would publish kind of the organizations and corporations that got their 100% backing for taking moves that they saw as LGBT affirming. And you know what? I think a lot of corporations realized it was never enough. No matter what they did, kind of the activist community always wanted to move the goalpost. And I think even with the election of Donald Trump last year, that sent kind of a signal to a lot of these corporations, big business, that a lot of Americans feel tired of kind of this woke ideology, these different ideas, critical theory. I think a lot of CEOs realize this is actually simply not in the best interest of our shareholders, and then they've stepped back. And so I do think there was probably political reasons. They felt bullied into it over the last 10 years. And so this is a welcome reprieve from that.
Well, David, there's another potential explanation for why there could be kind of a decline in enthusiasm for Pride Month, and that is that it's just the new norm now. And are you at all concerned that Pride Month has kind of made its impact? Because we talked about the decline in support amongst Republicans, but same-sex marriage still polls very favorably across the public. And for so many people, like, what the sexual revolution has done is so normal that maybe it's not even like controversial, and they don't feel the need to be a crusader for something that has been normalized. While I do think there's, especially on the trans issues, a growing awareness of the harms. You talk about boys on the podium at girls' track meets and cartoon porn in schools and, drag queens twerking in front of small children, right? All of this stuff that a lot of us look at and say that's terrible. And I think there's general recognition of that. Has the damage already been done culturally?
I think at some place, yes, a lot of this has been normalized. But Joseph, I would argue that, the further you abstract from God's created order, the more aberrations kind of you introduce into culture. Well, one, as Christians, we believe Romans 1, you're inviting God's judgment. And that's something that we should be nervous about, of course. For those of us who love our neighbors, we love folks in our communities. But I think that's a fair point. I would probably concede that. For many people, especially the younger generations, this is normalized. College students today, they don't know a day, Joseph, when same-sex marriage wasn't the law of the land. The Obergefell decision was handed down 2015. That was 10 years ago. A college student today was 10 years old when that happened. And so a lot of that has happened, which is why I argue those with teaching, preaching, discipleship opportunities, we can't take it for granted that people in our churches actually know what a biblical sexual ethic is, and all the more reason to kind of recommit in our teaching and our preaching on what God's Word actually teaches on these fundamental issues.
David, how can churches do that? How can people who care, who see what's happening and want to do something about it, be part of the solution?
Yeah, well, and that's one of the reasons the Center for Biblical Worldview exists. You can go to frc.org/worldview. We have a whole host of resources. If you have preaching, teaching, discipleship opportunities, we have resources on marriage, sexuality, religious liberty, political engagement, abortion, and the value of life. So I'd encourage folks to go to frc.org/worldview, and Lord willing, those resources can serve you and your ministry.
And they do, and they will. And, this is, we're not quite halfway through the month. There's going to be a lot more coming. And I would just commend people to the resources that you have put together, that we collectively have put together there at frc.org/worldview. It will encourage you, but it will also equip you to understand what's going on this month, because we really do not wrestle against flesh and blood. David Closson, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.